Metaversity.
Greetings, I am Shad, and Dragon's Dogma, the full package including Dark Arisen, in my opinion is the best action RPG ever made.
What?
You could probably imagine that I am pretty darn excited that finally, after so long, Dragon's Dogma 2 has been announced and is in development, and I am very, very excited. But with my excitement comes hope, because as great as Dragon's Dogma is, there are things that I think that they could improve or extend, complete what they were kind of exploring in Dragon's Dogma 1, and go further in Dragon's Dogma 2 to make it even better. And that's what I want to go through in this video with you. First, why I feel it's the best action RPG ever made, and two, the things that I think could be added or improved upon to make it even better. So Dragon's Dogma did some things really, really well that other great action RPGs also did. So it gave us the things we love, and then also gave us things that haven't really been done or only done lightly in other games, expanding what this genre is capable of, and it was just so good. To begin with, its look and aesthetic was grounded and immersive. It was respectful to the medieval culture that this fantasy setting was drawing upon, and it also pushed the boundaries into more fantastical things while still giving some connection to realism and practicality, or the aesthetic look of medieval culture. I really love that a lot of Japanese developers have been doing this more recently. One of the primary examples that we see of this is actually in the Dark Souls franchise, including Elden Ring. There's just such a massive difference in armor that looks like this versus armor that looks like this. Next is the freedom in character creation. You got to pick your face shape, the body proportions, hairstyle, shape of nose, height, and the height of your character reflected certain things in game, such as stamina and weight carrying capacity. Of course, other games have character creation, but oftentimes they just pay lip service to them. You can pick a random face, hair color, slight body proportions. Dragon's Dogma went much further to give you heaps more freedom. You could pick the size and girth of the arms versus the legs, the muscularity, the weight, and although not necessarily perfect, it was so much better than most other games. But there are things that I would like them to improve upon in Dragon's Dogma 2, more on that later. The other aspect to their freedom in the character creation is they did something really awesome that so few games have done before. Most RPGs have the armor or clothing options as a piece for the chest, the pants, the feet, the hands, and the head. Dragon's Dogma took it a step further and allowed layering for some of these sections on the body. There were 2 layers on the chest, so you could have an underlayer and an overlayer, 2 layers on the legs, underlayer and overlayer. This allowed for mixing and matching to such a greater degree, and I have made hundreds of different characters. The fashion Souls aspect of Dragon's Dogma kicks the crap out of the Souls genre by far. It was phenomenal and fun to make such a diverse range of styles and looks. And I loved it so much that there are a couple of things I'd love added to it, hopefully that we could see in Dragon's Dogma 2. But with the joy, the sheer variety that you had in character creation, Dragon's Dogma did another thing that I have not seen really any other RPG, let alone action RPG, do, and that is the pawn system. Not only could you create your main character, you would create a companion character called a pawn, which literally doubled up the freedom and options you could explore in the character creation. There are so many different characters I often like playing, and it was really fun to make like a companion team up where you would make a pawn that complemented your main character. And then the system in which other players could hire out your pawn and have them join your party just encouraged you to try and make the most awesome pawn you could to attract other people to hire them, because that would give you a kind of secondary currency called Rift Crystals, which were used in different aspects in the game. The way they integrated the pawns were brilliant, where they weren't overpowered but really helpful. Winning the bosses was very much reliant on your ability to play it, and a pawn would never dominate a boss battle. They were there to help you out with damage and also support for healing, and also doing certain damage types that your character might not be capable of if you had a solid melee build or magic build. You would hire the pawns based on the character classes you needed to complement and complete your party. This added another tactical level of depth to the game, increasing the options you had to try and handle the challenge. The story and questing is considered one of the weaker parts of the game, but I actually found it massively enjoyable, primarily thanks to the cutscenes. I loved seeing the characters I crafted, and watching these scenes with different characters I had made was just a joy. But there is of course room for improvement in the questing and characterization of the NPCs, but that's actually not the kind of main goal or purpose, because Dragon's Dogma is an action RPG, and as you can imagine, one of the primary aspects of this game is one of its best features, the combat. Dragon's Dogma combat was just phenomenal on so many levels. I loved the challenge and difficulty, and nearly every playthrough I do is always on Nightmare difficulty because the challenge is so much fun, and the tactics you could employ to overcome the challenge was hugely satisfying. Not only that, you would use different tactics dependent on your character class. Certain enemies were weak to certain damage types. Timing was very important, the attack animations were fixed, so it was very Dark Souls-like, but then it had a feature that so few games have implemented, and that is the climbing feature that you do in combat when you're fighting these massive large creatures to get to vulnerable spots. You don't always need to climb, there are other options for attacking creatures, but it was a massively fun and immersive element that just enhanced the combat tremendously. Dragon's Dogma is by far the most enjoyable, fun, and expansive combat system of any action RPG I have ever played, and that is including the Dark Souls and Dark Souls-like games. There's not to say there isn't areas for improvement. The types of attack variety and timing in Elden Ring, for instance, is brilliant, and I think Dragon's Dogma could improve in giving some of its bosses a more expansive list of moves and movements, telegraphs, combos that you could use in combat better. So when you combine all these elements that I've just listed, and there are other little gems that you can consider when looking at the gameplay and the quality overall, that when added together makes Dragon's Dogma the best action RPG ever. So now let's look at Dragon's Dogma 2, because there are some features that I would love to see added or expanded upon. First thing that I feel really needs to be added in Dragon's Dogma 2 is dyes for the armor and clothing to change the colors. The mix and matching was such an incredibly fun feature in Dragon's Dogma, but one of the things that let it down is sometimes the colors of certain clothing or armor items didn't match the color of other ones, which caused creating a matching set or look very difficult, and sometimes they just couldn't work together because the colors were so different. For the joy of the freedom and variety that Dragon's Dogma added, I really think dyes should be an essential feature to Dragon's Dogma 2. On top of that, I would love more variety in the clothing and armor, more options, more fashion variety, and then on top of that, something really important is being able to do transmog, which means transferring the look of one piece to another armor piece so you can get the added benefits of better stats and not sacrificing your look. This was a bit of a letdown in some of the end game equipment in Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, because there were actually very few endgame items, which restricted the variety you had in trying to craft an endgame character or pawn in how they looked. Some people might say, no, we need the endgame items to look a very specific way so people can recognize it, and when they're looking for a high-end pawn, it's easier to identify based on the ones wearing the best gear. I think there are a number of ways you could address this and still give us the transmog feature, and it could be giving endgame gear or items a certain glow or aura that remains with the item regardless to how you make it look. Separate to light glowing or something like that, it could ripple the air or have some type of visual effect to help people cue in that this person or pawn is wearing endgame items. I'd love to be able to do the transmog feature to some of the weapons as well, so much so that I've actually done mods in Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen which switches the look of some of these endgame items to other items that I just prefer the look of, specifically the endgame greatsword and arming sword. There were just other weapons that looked so much better. The Fashion Souls aspect of Dragon's Dogma was just so much fun that not only would I love these features that I've already mentioned added, there's a couple more that I feel would be brilliant. One of these is a feature that we see in the video game Code Vein, and that is you can add and remove certain peripheral elements to a piece of clothing, and I'd love this feature in Dragon's Dogma to both clothing and armor. For instance, there are certain armor pieces that just have certain parts on it that I don't like. Perfect example is the Morian plate, which has this weird half breastplate on it, but it has some of the best shoulder pieces in the game. I found a mod which removed that breastplate so you could get these awesome shoulder pieces and reach the aesthetic look that you wanted. It would be brilliant if this was actually integrated in the game so you could actually choose to either remove part of an armor like one or both of the pauldrons and just the breastplate, or remove the part of the breastplate, the whole breastplate, to get the pauldrons, for instance. The solar armor in Dragon's Dogma is one of the best looking breastplates, but it has such a massive fold underneath. It would be great if you had the option to remove a fold or add a fold. I have a mod that literally removed the fold in Dragon's Dogma 1 because, again, I didn't like it. It would be so awesome if we had this freedom in the game, and not just larger pieces, but even smaller little aesthetic elements to a piece of armor or clothing. Short sleeves, long sleeves, have a belt appear or disappear, all these smaller aspects to many different armor or clothing pieces, having the freedom to add or remove would be brilliant. The next and last feature I would love added to the clothing and armor options for Dragon's Dogma 2 is being able to actually choose certain textures for different pieces of clothing or armor. What do I mean? It would be great if you could add colored like stamps onto different pieces of armor, so you could give a crest or insignia. You can do this in the Soul Calibur 6 character creator, which expands the options considerably. It even goes further in Soul Calibur 6 to the point where you can actually add textures to clothing, which can change up the look of a piece of clothing entirely. This might not necessarily work for Dragon's Dogma, because changing the texture of a chainmail hauberk to, say, cloth or something like that, granted, doesn't really make sense. But if you had the freedom to change certain textures but stay within the material ranges that the armor or piece of clothing is supposed to be, that would be awesome. For instance, imagine having a breastplate that you could choose to be painted or to have cloth overlay on top, for it to be a type of brigandine, or just polished metal. What if you could change the textures on many of the mail armor pieces between scale mail to chain mail to ring mail, the size of the rings, or parts of the rings that might be a different color, like gold. Any type of clothing or cloth, it would be great if you could choose between, say, padded gambeson, leather, satin cloth, any number of those things. It's not necessary, but it would increase the freedom and options. But even if that doesn't work, it would be great if you could add stamps on top of armor, which would, as I mentioned, just increase the variety further. While we're on the subject of how your character or pawns look, let's talk a little bit more about character creation. For the sequel, I really am expecting a more expansive and versatile character creator, something in which you could change thickness of arms versus thickness of legs, width of hips, width of shoulders, size of shoulders, width of neck, basically every single aspect of a character's body. I'm really hoping we have the freedom to change, make bigger, smaller, to craft any type of characters we can imagine. There are a lot of character creators already out there doing this, so I actually feel this is almost a necessity to remain true to the tradition that the first Dragon's Dogma set in crafting any type of character you can imagine, because there were limitations in the Dragon's Dogma character creator. The fact that the thickness of legs was tied to the width of the hips limited the overall figure that you could try and give to a character. The depth and width of a chest was tied to the width of the shoulders, which also limited things, and that the width of the chest and hips did not scale with the height of the character. This gave very few options to the look or figure of a character that was short, because there was only one or two chest or leg options you could choose to match that height of character. There's two larger subjects that I'll be talking about, specifically the class system and also combat. But before we go into those larger ones, small little things that I hope to see an improvement on for Dragon's Dogma 2 is a bigger map, and on that map, more variety in map encounters. In Dragon's Dogma 1, the same monsters always spawned in the same place. It'd be great if there was a bit more variety, that monsters or creatures kind of migrated or moved over the map, more kind of random encounters, encountering appropriate types of creatures for the area you're in, of course. The next thing that I'd love to see is a better story. It's not necessary for an action RPG, but it would certainly improve it. And with a better story, I would love to see some more player choice in quest resolutions, or the ability to play as good or evil, better interactions with NPCs and stuff. These are smaller elements to the Dragon's Dogma experience, because as I mentioned, it's an action RPG, it's not really meant to be a story-driven RPG, but I certainly wouldn't complain with improvements in those areas. So now let's talk about the combat. Dragon's Dogma combat is brilliant, but there are areas in which it can be improved upon. For one, more diverse combat animations. Most weapons had a light or heavy attack, but they were all very much the same and they weren't very diverse. I'd particularly love if both light and heavy attacks had up to 3 to 5 different animations that were almost randomly selected. And the game randomly selects a type of animation, and these animations should have the same kind of hitbox or range, and yes, you can choose different animations, movements that have very similar hitboxes, and all the light attacks will do the same damage as well as the heavy attacks. But if the game had kind of a selection between a slash from left to right, right to left, or a sequence of up to 5 movements that had a different kind of combo or look between them, would be brilliant. I give some examples of different combat animations in previous videos, and I also show that you can do more realistic combat animations and still achieve all the requirements of the gameplay, where I remake some key Elden Ring animations showing that you can do more realistic and immersive animations even in fantasy video games. And while we're on the subject of weapon animations, let's talk about the weapons specifically. I would love to see more weapons, different types. Of course, keep all the weapons from the first game, but it would be great if we could add spears, polearms like halberds, a mid-range two-handed sword like a longsword or katana, that's not to the extreme extent of these massive oversized two-handed swords, and the next category down from that sword is just one-handed sword. What about adding one or two-handed axes, warhammers, crossbows? And also, if you're going to do large shields again, please don't have them permanently fixed onto the character's back and they only grab it when they want to block. For big shields like that, let us choose to wear it on the back or hold it in our hand while we're walking. Give us the freedom to determine that, because it was so frustrating. The Mystic Knight class always having this massive shield on your back, which one, blocked the view of your character, and looked really dumb that you would only grab the shield out the very moment you want to block or to cast a spell or skill with it, and as soon as you were done, in the middle of combat, putting it back on your back. It was ridiculous. And I think the game devs kind of knew this, because a lot of the monsters and even NPCs that were using the same size shields would just hold it in their hand. It was such a massive pet peeve of mine. I couldn't stand it, to the point that I now have a mod which just makes the massive shields disappear entirely and change some of the lighter shields that you could always use in your hand to adopt the look of the heavier ones. Mods, they're great. But it also reveals one of the pet peeves and issues we have for the game that really should be fixed for the sequel. The next thing with combat is to go further with the climbing mechanics, so you can climb over terrain or up buildings, but of course you should restrict the speed in which you can climb and how easy it is to climb buildings and things like that by, say, the armor people are wearing. Heavier armor should mean much slower and less parkour type of climbing, and lighter characters should be able to climb up things faster and kind of parkour their way over terrain, Assassin's Creed style. The next and last big thing that I think can be reworked and improved upon in Dragon's Dogma is the class system. I was satisfied enough with the variety of classes in Dragon's Dogma 1, but there were little things of frustration, especially for those classes that could only use one weapon versus the classes that could use two weapons or equip a wider variety of skills. I feel the character should have the freedom to pick any weapon that is available. Keep the class system, but allow all classes to use any weapon, and they would have unique skills for that weapon based on their class. And so a warrior could actually equip, say, daggers, longsword, or the classic big sword, but the skills that you could use for these daggers now would be based on the warrior, strength-based kind of attacks and things that you do with the daggers, versus more nimble jumping attacks that you might do if you were a ranger. Same with Mystic Knight or Mystic Archer, equipping any weapon, including staff, shield, big two-handed sword, unique skills based on those classes. And so a sorcerer that, say, equips a sword would have kind of like Mystic Knight skills that they could just use with that weapon. A rogue that equips that same sword would have more nimble kind of assassin-like skills, versus a warrior which would have really strong, heavy-hitting skills specific for the warrior class. I would love this. So once again, you could keep the class system, but allow them to pick any weapon they want. Because once again, Dragon's Dogma 1 was unbalanced in this, because some classes had a wider variety of weapons that they could choose versus others, the most being the assassin, of course. They could use sword, dagger, shield, and short bow. And even though you can only equip 2 weapons at a time, you can keep the other weapons in your inventory and just select to those weapons when you needed to on the fly, which made the assassin a hugely overpowered and unbalanced class for the game overall. So, as I mentioned, allowing all classes to pick all the weapons available would fix that unbalance, increase the freedom of the type of characters that you want to explore and play, and just make a better game overall. And there we go. These are the improvements that I personally would love to see for Dragon's Dogma 2. Don't know if any of them will be adopted. I just hope that the game will be at least as good as the first one. But because there are areas for improvement, I would love it if it's even better. It's my favorite game of all time. Really looking for Dragon's Dogma number 2. If you haven't tried Dragon's Dogma 1, still, like I said, best game I've ever played. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed. And of course, I hope to see you on the next video on Shadowversity. So until that time, farewell.